The auction block was caked with mud and old snow, and Eliza Boone stood on it like livestock waiting to be sold. Her hands were raw from cold, her dress torn at the hem, and beside her stood Noah, 7 years old, silent as stone, eyes locked on nothing. The crowd jeered. Someone shouted a bid like she was worth less than a lame horse. The saloon boss grinned, moving closer with a look that made her stomach twist. Then a voice cut through the noise, low, steady, final. "I'll pay the full debt, right now." A man she had never seen stepped forward, and everything stopped. If you want to see how far a story like this can travel, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. And if this opening pulled you in, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The winter sky over Red Hollow was the color of iron, heavy and unforgiving, pressed low enough to smother hope. Snow had fallen the night before, just enough to turn the town's rutted main street into a slick, frozen mess. Eliza Boone stood in the center of it all, shoulders squared against the wind, trying not to feel the eyes on her. She had been standing on that auction block for 20 minutes. 20 minutes of whispers, 20 minutes of laughter that didn't bother to hide itself. 20 minutes of men weighing her worth like she was a sack of grain that might not be worth the storage space. Her father had been dead 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and the vultures had already picked the bones of everything he'd left behind. The forge was gone. The tools were gone. The little cabin at the edge of town where she'd grown up, fixing horseshoes and mending plow blades, gone. All of it swallowed by debts she hadn't even known existed until the banker showed up with a ledger and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your father owed more than you can pay, Miss Boone," he'd said, voice flat as a nail being driven into wood. "The law says we settle it one way or another." She'd tried. She'd begged for time, offered to work, promised she could make it right. But Red Hollow didn't run on promises. It ran on cash, cruelty, and the kind of frontier justice that bent whichever way power wanted it to. So here she was, on a block, in the cold, with her little brother beside her. Noah hadn't spoken since their father died. Not a word, not a sound. He just stood there now, small and thin in a coat 2 sizes too big, staring at the frozen ground like if he looked hard enough, it might open up and swallow him whole. Eliza wanted to tell him it would be okay. She wanted to promise him they'd get through this, but she couldn't lie to him, not anymore. The auctioneer was a wiry man named Kern, all sharp angles and sharper words. He stood to the side of the block with a wooden gavel in one hand and a smirk that never quite left his face. He'd done this before, sold people, sold futures, sold whatever the town decided had a price. "Let's get on with it," Kern called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Eliza Boone, 22 years old, strong as an ox, maybe stronger by the look of her." He paused for the laugh. It came. "And the boy, Noah, 7, quiet type, comes with the package." Eliza's jaw tightened. She felt Noah press closer to her leg. "Starting bid," Kern continued, "is $200. That's what's owed. Anyone willing to take on the debt gets both of them. Labor, service, whatever arrangement you see fit. All legal, all square." The crowd shifted. A few men stepped forward. Most just watched. Eliza recognized some of them. The butcher who used to buy scrap iron from her father. The freight driver who'd once told her she had a good arm for hammering steel. The carpenter who always looked at her a little too long when she came into town. None of them were looking at her like a person now. "Do I hear 200? Kern asked. Silence. "Come on, folks, she's a hard worker, knows her way around a forge. Good cook, I'd wager. And the boy, he'll grow into something useful." Still nothing. Kern's smirk faltered. He didn't like a slow auction. "175 then. Let's not waste daylight." A hand went up near the back. Eliza couldn't see who it belonged to, but Kern's face brightened. "There we go, 175. Do I hear 200? Another hand, this one closer. A man in a wool coat and a hat pulled low. Eliza didn't know his name, but she'd seen him before. He ran a logging camp up north. Rough work, rough men. 200, Kern said, nodding. "Now we're moving. Do I hear 225? The saloon boss stepped forward. His name was Hadley Voss, and he was the kind of man who smiled when he wanted something and didn't bother when he already had it. He owned the Silver Spur, the biggest saloon in Red Hollow, and half the buildings on the south end of town. He also owned the sheriff, or near enough that it didn't matter. Voss didn't raise his hand. He just looked at Kern and said, 300. The crowd went quiet. Kern blinked. 300. Well now, that's a serious bid, Mr. Voss. Voss's smile was thin and cold. I'm a serious man. Eliza's stomach turned over. She knew what that bid meant. She knew what working for Voss would mean. The women who worked at the Silver Spur didn't just serve drinks, and the ones who tried to leave didn't get far. She looked down at Noah. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight. He wasn't looking at Voss. He wasn't looking at anything. 300, Kern repeated, louder now, playing to the crowd. That's a fine offer. Do I hear 350? No one moved. 325? Nothing. Kern raised the gavel. Going once. I'll pay the full debt. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, low and steady, with the kind of weight that didn't need volume to carry. Every head turned. A man stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, and years spent outside the comfort of towns like this. He wore a long coat dusted with snow, boots that had seen hard miles, and a hat that shadowed his eyes but didn't hide the set of his jaw. Eliza had never seen him before. Kern frowned. And you are? Gideon Vale. The name didn't mean anything to Eliza, but a few people in the crowd shifted, exchanged glances. Whoever he wasn't a stranger to everyone. You got that kind of money, Mr. Vale? Kern asked, skepticism thick in his voice. Gideon reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He opened it, counted out bills with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and held them up. $200, he said. The full debt. No auction. No bidding. I pay it. They're free. Kern's eyes narrowed. That's not how this works. It's exactly how this works, Gideon said, his voice still calm but edged with something harder now. The debt's 200. I'm paying 200. Unless you're telling me this isn't about settling a debt at all. Voss stepped forward, his smile gone. The auction's already started, friend. You can't just walk in and... I can, Gideon interrupted. And I am. He turned to Kern. Take the money, or I'll take it to the sheriff and explain why you're running an auction that isn't legal in the first place. Kern's face flushed. Now hold on. There's no law that says debt settlement has to go through auction if someone's willing to pay in full, Gideon continued. And if you want to argue that point, we can do it in front of the territorial judge when he rides through next month. The crowd murmured. A few men stepped back. Voss's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Kern looked at the money in Gideon's hand, then at Voss, then back at Gideon. Finally, he snatched the bills and stuffed them into his coat. Fine, he muttered. Debt's paid. Gideon nodded once, then turned to Eliza. His eyes were gray, sharp, but not unkind. You're safe with me, he said quietly. Both of you. Eliza stared at him. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she should believe him, didn't know what safe even meant anymore. But Noah's hand tightened around hers, and when Gideon extended his hand toward the edge of the block, she took it. He helped her down, helped Noah down, and without another word, he turned and walked toward a horse tied to the post at the far end of the street. Eliza followed, half in shock, half in disbelief, the crowd parting around them like water around stone. The horse was a big bay gelding, calm-eyed and steady. Gideon untied the reins and glanced back at Eliza and Noah. Can you ride? He asked. Eliza shook her head. Then you'll ride with me. The boy can sit in front. He lifted Noah up first, settling him onto the saddle with surprising gentleness. Then he mounted behind him and reached down for Eliza. She hesitated. I'm not leaving you here, Gideon said, and we've got a storm coming in. If you're going to ask questions, do it on the trail. Eliza glanced back at the crowd. Voss was still watching, his face unreadable. Kern had disappeared. The rest of the town just stared. She took Gideon's hand and let him pull her up behind him. The saddle was crowded, and she had to hold on to his coat to keep from sliding off, but the horse didn't seem to mind the extra weight. Gideon clicked his tongue, and they started moving, the town falling away behind them with every step. Eliza didn't look back. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour. The road, if it could be called that, wound through pine forests and over frozen creek beds, climbing steadily into the hills. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow, and the sky grew darker. Gideon didn't speak. Neither did Noah, and Eliza didn't know what to say. Finally, as they crested a ridge and the forest opened up into a wide, snow-covered valley, Gideon pulled the horse to a stop. "There," he said, nodding toward the far end of the valley. Eliza followed his gaze. A ranch sat nestled against the base of the mountains, its buildings low and weathered but solid. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, thin and steady. A barn stood to one side, a smaller cabin to the other, and beyond that a series of corrals and outbuildings half buried in snow. It looked remote, isolated, hard, but it also looked real. "That's home," Gideon said. "Or it will be if you're willing." Eliza frowned. "What do you mean?" He glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't buy you, Miss Boone. I paid your debt. There's a difference. You and your brother are free to leave any time you want. But if you're looking for work, I've got it. A place to stay, food, wages, fair terms, no tricks." She searched his face for the lie, for the angle, for the thing he wasn't saying, but all she saw was exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying something heavy for too long. "Why?" she asked. Gideon looked forward again, toward the ranch. "Because I needed the help, and because no one deserves to be sold like livestock." He clicked his tongue, and the horse started moving again, down into the valley, toward the house and whatever came next. Eliza held on, Noah silent in front of her, and tried to decide whether hope was something she could afford to feel again. The ranch house was larger than it had looked from the ridge, built from logs chinked with clay and stone, with a steep roof to shed the snow. The porch was wide, covered, and mostly clear of ice. Gideon dismounted first, then helped Noah down, then Eliza. Her legs were stiff from the ride, and she nearly stumbled, but she caught herself on the porch railing. Gideon tied the horse and grabbed a saddlebag from the back. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you inside before the storm hits." He pushed open the door, and warmth rolled out like a wave. The interior was dim but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling behind an iron grate. A table sat in the center of the room, flanked by mismatched chairs. Shelves lined the walls, holding tin plates, cups, jars of preserves, and a few books with cracked spines. Everything was functional, sparse, but cared for. Gideon set the saddlebag down and gestured toward the fire. "Warm up. I'll get some coffee going." Eliza didn't move. She was still trying to process the fact that she was here, that she wasn't in a cage or a cellar or being handed over to Hadley Voss. Noah moved first. He walked straight to the fire and sat down on the floor in front of it, pulling his knees to his chest. Gideon watched him for a moment, then turned to Eliza. "You can take the room at the end of the hall. It's small, but it's yours. I'll sleep out here." You don't have to." "I do," he said quietly. "You don't know me. I don't expect you to trust me, so I'll make it easy. You get a room with a lock. I stay out here. No arguments." Eliza stared at him. "Why are you doing this?" Gideon didn't answer right away. He moved to the stove, filled a kettle from a bucket of water, and set it on the heat. Then he turned back to her, his expression softer now, but still guarded. "I had a wife," he said, "and a daughter. They died 2 years ago. Fever. I couldn't stop it, couldn't save them. This house has been empty ever since, too empty. When I saw you on that block today, I saw someone who needed help, and I figured maybe helping you would be a way to stop feeling so damn useless." The honesty of it hit her like a fist. She didn't know what to say. Gideon turned back to the stove. "Get some rest, Miss Boone. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Eliza looked at Noah, still silent by the fire. Then she looked at the hallway, at the door Gideon had pointed to. She didn't trust easily, couldn't afford to. But for the first time in 3 weeks, she wasn't standing on an auction block, and that, she thought, was enough for now. She walked down the hall, opened the door, and stepped inside. The room was small. A bed, a chair, a window that looked out over the valley. Nothing more. But it was hers. She closed the door, sat down on the bed, and let herself breathe. Outside, the storm finally broke, and the snow began to fall in earnest. Eliza woke to the smell of bacon. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came back. The auction, the ride, the ranch, Gideon's quiet promise. She sat up, her body aching from the cold and the tension she'd been carrying for weeks. The room was dim, but light filtered in through the window. Morning. She'd slept through the night. She stood, smoothed her dress as best she could, and opened the door. The main room was brighter now. The fire built up, and the shutters pulled back to let in the gray winter light. Gideon stood at the stove, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet. Noah sat at the table, a tin cup in front of him, staring into it like it held the answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. Gideon glanced over as Eliza entered. "Morning. Coffee's on the table. Help yourself." She poured herself a cup and sat down across from Noah. He didn't look up. Gideon brought the skillet over and set it on the table, along with a plate of biscuits and a pot of something that smelled like beans. "Eat," he said. "We've got work to do today, and you'll need your strength." Eliza took a biscuit. It was warm, flaky, better than anything she'd had in weeks. She ate slowly, watching Gideon as he moved around the kitchen with the kind of efficiency that came from doing the same tasks 1,000 times. "What kind of work?" she asked. Gideon sat down and poured himself a cup of coffee. "Ranch work. Feeding stock, mucking stalls, fixing what's broken. I've got 2 hands who come in from the bunkhouse to help, but they're out checking the herd right now. Storm probably scattered them some." "And you want me to help," he said simply. "However you can. You said your father was a blacksmith. That true?" Eliza nodded. "Then you know your way around a forge." "Some." "Good. Mine's been cold for 2 years. If you can get it running again, that'd be worth more than wages." She frowned. "You're paying me?" "I told you. Fair terms. You work, you get paid. Same as anyone else." Eliza looked at Noah. He was nibbling on a piece of bacon, his eyes still distant. "And him?" she asked. Gideon followed her gaze. "He can help where he's able, or he can rest. Doesn't matter to me. He's been through enough." The kindness in his voice was so unexpected that Eliza didn't know how to respond. She just nodded and went back to her breakfast. God. After they ate, Gideon led her outside to show her the ranch. The snow had stopped, but the sky was still heavy, threatening more. The cold was sharp, biting through her thin coat, and she wrapped her arms around herself as they walked. Gideon didn't seem to notice the cold. He pointed out the barn, the bunkhouse, the chicken coop, the root cellar. He showed her the well, the woodpile, the smokehouse. Everything was practical, well-built, designed to survive winters that could kill. The forge sat near the barn, a low stone structure with a chimney and a bellows that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Eliza stepped inside and ran her hand over the anvil. It was dusty, but solid. The tools were still hanging on the wall. Hammers, tongs, files, all the things she'd grown up using. "Can you work with this?" Gideon asked. She nodded. "If I can get the fire hot enough." "I'll help you. We'll start tomorrow." They walked back toward the house, and as they did, 2 men on horseback emerged from the tree line, driving a small group of cattle ahead of them. They were bundled in heavy coats and scarves, their faces red from the cold. Gideon raised a hand in greeting, and they rode over. "Gideon," the older of the 2 said, his voice rough. "Found most of them. Lost 3 to the ravine, but the rest are accounted for." "Good work, Charlie," Gideon gestured to Eliza. "This is Eliza Boone. She and her brother are staying on. She'll be helping around the place." Charlie looked her over, his expression neutral. The younger man beside him, barely out of his teens, just stared. "Ma'am," Charlie said with a nod. Eliza nodded back. Gideon turned to the younger man. "This is Sam. He's green, but he's learning." Sam flushed and looked away. "Get the cattle into the near pasture," Gideon said. "We'll check them again this afternoon." Charlie nodded, and the 2 men rode off. Gideon looked at Eliza. "They're good men. Won't give you trouble." "And if they do?" His expression didn't change. "Then they won't be working here anymore." Eliza believed him. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Eliza woke early, helped with breakfast, then spent her mornings working alongside Gideon. They repaired fences, hauled firewood, mucked out stalls. The work was hard, but it was honest, and for the first time in her life, no one mocked her for being strong. Gideon never treated her like she was fragile. He handed her an axe and expected her to use it. He showed her how to splice a broken rope and didn't hover while she did it. He asked her opinion on whether a post was rotted through, and when she said it was, he believed her. It was strange. unsettling. And slowly, over the course of those first few days, it started to feel normal. Noah stayed close to the house. He didn't speak, but he started eating more. He followed Eliza around sometimes, watching her work with those big, silent eyes. Once, when she was chopping wood, he picked up a small piece and handed it to her. She took it and smiled. He didn't smile back, but he stayed. At night, after the work was done and the fire was built up, Gideon would sit at the table and read. Sometimes he'd read aloud, old stories, bits of news from months-old newspapers, anything to fill the silence. Eliza listened, mending clothes or sharpening tools, and Noah sat by the fire, still quiet, but not as far away as he'd been. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something close. On the 5th day, Gideon took her to the forge. They spent the morning cleaning it out, sweeping ash, checking the bellows, making sure the chimney wasn't clogged. By midday, they had a fire going, small at first, then building as Eliza worked the bellows and fed it coal. The heat was intense, familiar, comforting. She felt something loosen in her chest as the fire roared to life. Gideon watched her, his arms crossed. "You know what you're doing." "My father taught me," she said, "before he got sick." "What did you make?" "Tools, mostly. Horseshoes, nails, whatever people needed." Gideon nodded. "I need a new latch for the barn door. Think you can manage that?" Eliza looked at the fire, at the tools on the wall, at the anvil waiting. "Yes," she said, and she did. By the end of the day, she'd forged a latch that was stronger and cleaner than anything Gideon had expected. He held it up to the light, tested the weight, then looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You're good," he said. Eliza shrugged. "I'm competent." "You're better than that." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. But as they walked back to the house that evening, the sky streaked with orange and purple, Eliza realized something. She hadn't thought about Red Hollow all day, hadn't thought about the auction or Voss or the weight of being unwanted. She just worked. And for the first time in a long time, that had been enough. That night, after supper, Gideon pulled out a small wooden box from a shelf and set it on the table. He opened it carefully, and inside were a few coins, a folded piece of paper, and a single photograph. He took out the photograph and handed it to Eliza. It showed a woman and a little girl, both smiling. The woman had kind eyes. The girl had curls and a gap-toothed grin. "That's them," Gideon said quietly. "My wife, Caroline. My daughter, Emma." Eliza looked at the photo, then at him. "I'm sorry." He nodded. "Me too." He took the photo back and returned it to the box. Then he pulled out the folded paper and set it in front of her. "This is the agreement," he said. "Fair wages, room and board, and freedom to leave whenever you choose. I'll sign it. You can too if you want. Or you can just take my word." Eliza stared at the paper. She'd never had a contract before, never had anything in writing that said she mattered. She picked up the pen Gideon offered and signed her name. He signed his. And just like that, it was real. "Thank you," she said. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You've earned it." Outside, the wind picked up, and the first flakes of another storm began to fall. But inside, the fire burned warm, and for the first time since her father died, Eliza Boone felt like she might actually survive this. The storm that had threatened all evening finally broke just after midnight, and by morning the world was buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Eliza woke to a silence so complete it felt like the earth had stopped breathing. She dressed quickly, her breath misting in the cold air of her room, and stepped out into the main hall. Gideon was already up, layering on his heavy coat and pulling his hat low. He glanced at her as she entered. "Storm's worse than I thought," he said. "I need to check the cattle. Some of them were in the far pasture. If they got caught out there, we'll have losses." Eliza crossed to the window and looked out. The snow was pristine, unbroken, and deep enough to swallow a man's boot to the knee. The barn was barely visible through the white haze. "I'll come with you," she said. Gideon paused, one hand on the door. "You don't have to." "I know." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Get your coat, and boots if you've got them." She didn't have boots, not real ones, but she wrapped her feet in extra cloth and pulled on the worn shoes she'd been wearing since Red Hollow. They wouldn't hold up long in snow this deep, but they'd have to do. Noah was still asleep in the corner by the fire, curled under a blanket Gideon had given him. Eliza touched his shoulder gently, and his eyes opened, dark and watchful. "Stay inside," she said softly. "Keep the fire going. We'll be back soon." He didn't answer, but he sat up, and she took that as understanding. Outside, the cold hit like a hammer. The wind had died down, but the air was sharp enough to cut, and the snow crunched underfoot with every step. Gideon led the way toward the barn, his strides long and purposeful, and Eliza followed, her legs already aching from the effort of pushing through the drifts. Charlie and Sam were in the barn, saddling horses with grim efficiency. Charlie looked up as they entered, his face lined with worry. "Lost sight of the herd last night," he said. "They were moving toward the ridge before the storm hit. If they went over the edge—" "They didn't," Gideon said, his voice steady. "They're smarter than that. They'll have found shelter. We just need to find them." Charlie didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. They rode out in pairs, Gideon and Eliza on one horse, Charlie and Sam on another. The snow was so deep the horses struggled, their breath coming in heavy clouds, their hooves breaking through the crust with every step. The world was white in every direction, the horizon lost in the haze, and Eliza had to trust that Gideon knew where he was going because she couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. They rode for nearly an hour before they found the first of the cattle. A small group, maybe 15 head, huddled together in a stand of pines where the snow wasn't quite as deep. They were cold, their hides dusted with frost, but they were alive. Gideon dismounted and moved among them, checking for injuries, counting heads. Eliza stayed on the horse, scanning the tree line for any sign of the rest of the herd. "There," she said suddenly, pointing toward a break in the trees. Gideon followed her gaze. In the distance, barely visible through the snow, was movement, dark shapes against the white. More cattle. "Good eye," he said, climbing back onto the horse. "Let's get 'em." They pushed deeper into the valley, and with every step the situation became clearer. The cattle had scattered in the storm, breaking into small groups that had sought whatever shelter they could find. Some were buried up to their chests in snowdrifts, lowing pitifully as they struggled to move. Others had found their way into thickets and gullies, trapped by the terrain. It took hours to round them up. Hours of hard, freezing, relentless work. Eliza's hands were numb, her face raw from the wind, but she didn't stop. She climbed down into snowdrifts to push cattle free, used her weight to lever fallen branches out of the way, and when one stubborn heifer refused to move, she grabbed it by the horns and pulled until it followed. Charlie watched her with something close to disbelief. "She's stronger than half the men I've worked with," he muttered to Gideon. Gideon didn't respond, but his eyes followed Eliza as she worked, and there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Something like recognition. By the time they had most of the herd together, the sun was past its peak and the temperature was dropping again. They started driving the cattle back toward the ranch, moving slowly through the deep snow, the horses straining under the effort. And then, just as they crested the last ridge before home, one of the cows panicked. It was a big animal, wild-eyed and skittish, and something, maybe the wind, maybe the cold, maybe just fear, set it off. It broke from the herd with a bellow and charged, not away, but directly toward Sam, who was on foot trying to guide a calf through a drift. Sam froze. The cow didn't. Eliza saw it happen in the space of a heartbeat, saw the animal lower its head, saw Sam's eyes go wide, saw the distance close too fast for anyone to react. She didn't think. She just moved. She threw herself off the horse and hit the snow running, her boots slipping, her breath tearing in her lungs. She reached Sam a half second before the cow did and shoved him aside with both hands, sending him sprawling into the snow. The cow hit her instead. The impact knocked the wind out of her and sent her stumbling backward, but she didn't fall. She planted her feet, grabbed the cow by the horns, and held on. The animal thrashed, twisting its head, trying to throw her off, but Eliza's hands were iron. She'd spent years working a forge, years gripping hammers and tongs and red-hot steel. Her father had always said she had the strongest hands he'd ever seen. Now she proved it. She wrestled the cow to a standstill, her boots digging into the snow, her muscles screaming, her face inches from the animal's wild, rolling eyes. And then slowly she forced its head down, forced it to submit, forced it to stop. The cow went still. Eliza let go and stepped back, her chest heaving, her hands shaking. The entire herd had stopped. Charlie, Sam, and Gideon were staring at her like she'd just pulled the sun out of the sky. Sam scrambled to his feet, his face pale. You saved my life. Eliza shook her head, trying to catch her breath. You would have done the same. I wouldn't have been strong enough, Sam said quietly. Charlie let out a low whistle. I'll be damned. Gideon rode up beside her, his expression unreadable. He looked at the cow, then at Eliza, then back at the cow. You all right? He asked. She nodded, though her ribs ached where the cow had hit her. Gideon's jaw tightened. That was reckless. That was necessary, she shot back. For a moment they just looked at each other. Then Gideon's expression softened, just slightly. Yeah, he said. It was. He held out his hand and she took it, letting him pull her back onto the horse. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but something had shifted. The ranch hands looked at her differently now. Not with pity or mockery, but with respect. And Gideon, though he didn't say it, looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was setting and the sky was streaked with gold and red. Eliza slid off the horse and nearly collapsed, her legs barely holding her up. Gideon caught her by the arm. Easy, he said. You've done enough for one day. She wanted to argue, but she was too exhausted. She let him guide her toward the house, and when they stepped inside, the warmth of the fire hit her like a wave. Noah was waiting by the door. His eyes went wide when he saw her, covered in snow, her face red and raw, her coat torn at the shoulder where the cow had caught it. He ran to her and threw his arms around her waist. Eliza froze. He hadn't touched her since their father died. Hadn't let anyone touch him. Slowly, carefully, she put her arms around him and held him close. I'm okay, she whispered. I'm okay. He didn't let go. Gideon stood in the doorway watching them, and when Eliza looked up, she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't name. Something that looked like grief and hope tangled together. He turned away and busied himself with the fire, giving them space. That night, after they'd eaten and the ranch hands had returned to the bunkhouse, Gideon sat across from Eliza at the table. The firelight flickered between them, casting long shadows on the walls. You didn't have to do that today, he said. Yes, I did. You could have been killed. So could Sam. Gideon shook his head. You don't owe us anything, Eliza. You don't owe me anything. She met his eyes. Maybe not, but I owe myself something. What's that? Proof that I'm not what they said I was. Gideon frowned. Who said what? Everyone. Her voice was quiet but steady. Every person in Red Hollow who looked at me and saw something ugly, something worth less than a lame horse, something to be sold and forgotten. Gideon's expression hardened. They were wrong. Were they? Yes. The certainty in his voice startled her. She looked away, her hands curling around her cup. I don't know what I am anymore, she said. I used to know. I was my father's daughter. I was a blacksmith. I had a place. And then he died. And everything I thought I was just disappeared. Gideon was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. You're the woman who pulled a cow off a man with her bare hands today. You're the woman who brought my forge back to life. You're the woman who's kept your brother alive when the whole world tried to break both of you. That's what you are. Eliza looked at him, her throat tight. And if anyone ever tells you different, Gideon continued, you send them to me. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she believed someone when they said she mattered. The weeks that followed were hard but steady. Winter tightened its grip on the valley, and every day brought new challenges. Frozen water troughs, broken fence lines, cattle that wandered too far and had to be brought back through snow that never seemed to stop falling. But the ranch held, and so did Eliza. She worked alongside Gideon and the hands, earning her place with every fence she mended, every tool she repaired, every meal she cooked that kept them all fed and warm. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was building something. Noah began to change too. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. He started following Sam around, watching him work with the horses. He helped Eliza in the forge, holding tools, pumping the bellows. He still didn't speak, but his eyes weren't as hollow as they'd been. One evening, as Eliza was finishing up in the forge, Gideon appeared in the doorway. He watched her for a moment, then stepped inside. "You've done good work here," he said. She set down the hammer she'd been using and wiped her hands on her apron. "It's what you hired me for." "I hired you to help. You've done more than that." She looked at him, unsure how to respond. Gideon crossed to the anvil and ran his hand over the tools she'd organized, the repairs she'd made, the new pieces she'd forged. "This place was dying," he said quietly. "After Caroline and Emma, I let it die. Didn't see the point in keeping it going." "And now?" Eliza asked. He looked at her. "Now I do." The weight of those words settled between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Gideon cleared his throat and stepped back. "There's something I need to tell you." Eliza's stomach tightened. "What?" "Charlie heard something in town last week. Word is Voss has been asking about you." Her blood went cold. "What kind of asking?" "The kind that means he hasn't forgotten. He's been telling people you belong to him, that the auction wasn't settled legally, that he's got a right to claim you back." Eliza's hands curled into fist. "He doesn't. I know that, but Voss doesn't care about what's legal. He cares about what he can get away with." "Then let him come," Eliza said, her voice hard. "I'm not going back." Gideon's expression darkened. "I won't let him take you, but you need to understand, if he comes here, it won't be alone, and it won't be friendly." Eliza met his eyes. "I'm not afraid of him." You should be." "Maybe, but I'm more afraid of going back to that block, of being sold again, of losing Noah." She took a breath. "So if Voss wants a fight, he'll get one." Gideon stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right, then we prepare." Over the next few days, the ranch took on a different atmosphere. Gideon cleaned his rifles, checked his ammunition, and made sure the locks on the doors and windows were solid. Charlie and Sam were briefed, and though Sam looked nervous, Charlie just nodded grimly and said, "We'll be ready." Eliza sharpened every blade in the house, repaired the hinges on the barn doors so they wouldn't squeak, and made sure the forge was ready in case they needed to make repairs or weapons in a hurry. Noah watched it all with wide, silent eyes, and Eliza could see the fear creeping back into his face. She knelt down beside him one evening and took his hands in hers. "We're going to be okay," she said. "I promise." He looked at her, and for a moment she thought he might speak, but he just nodded and leaned into her, and she held him until the fear in his eyes dimmed. The confrontation came on a gray afternoon 2 weeks later. Eliza was in the forge, working on a new gate latch, when she heard the sound of horses approaching. She set down her hammer and stepped outside. 5 riders were coming up the road from the valley, moving at a deliberate pace. Even from a distance, she recognized the man in front, Hadley Voss. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't move. She just stood there watching them come. Gideon emerged from the house, his rifle in hand. Charlie and Sam came out of the barn, both armed. They formed a line in front of the house, and Eliza walked over to join them. "Stay behind me," Gideon said quietly. "No." He looked at her, and she looked back, her jaw set. "I'm not hiding," she said. Gideon's expression was tight, but he didn't argue. The riders pulled up 20 feet from the house. Voss sat tall in his saddle, his face calm, his eyes cold. The men with him were hard-looking, the kind who'd do whatever they were paid to do and sleep fine afterward. "Gideon Vale," Voss said, his voice smooth. "It's been a while." "Not long enough," Gideon replied. Voss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here on business. That woman standing beside you belongs to me." "She doesn't belong to anyone. The law says different. The auction was legal. I had the winning bid before you interfered. I paid the debt in full. The auction was void." Voss shook his head slowly. "You paid a debt, but the girl was already mine. I've got the paperwork to prove it." He pulled a folded document from his coat and held it up. Signed by the auctioneer, witnessed by the town clerk, all legal. Gideon's jaw tightened. "That's a forgery." "Is it? Or did you just make a mistake, friend?" Eliza stepped forward. "I'm not going with you." Voss's eyes shifted to her, and his smile widened. "You don't get a say in this, sweetheart. You're property, and property doesn't talk back." "I'm not property," Eliza said, her voice steady. And I'm not yours. Voss's smile faded. You think because you've got Vale here playing hero, you're free? You think this ends well for you? He leaned forward in his saddle. I own half of Red Hollow. I own the sheriff. I own the judge. You can run, but there's nowhere you can go that I won't find you. Gideon raised his rifle, and the sound of the hammer cocking was loud in the silence. You're not taking her, and you're not setting foot on my land. Turn around and ride out, or I'll put you in the ground. Voss didn't flinch. You'd start a war over a woman you bought off an auction block? I'd start a war over what's right. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow, and the horses shifted uneasily. Then Voss straightened in his saddle. You're making a mistake, Vale. But if you want to play it this way, we'll play. He turned his horse and gestured to his men. Let's go. They rode out slowly, deliberately, and Eliza watched them until they disappeared into the tree line. Gideon lowered his rifle, but his hands were shaking. He'll be back. I know, Eliza said. And next time he'll bring more men. I know. Gideon looked at her, his expression raw. Why didn't you just stay quiet? Let me handle it. Because I'm done being quiet, Eliza said. I spent my whole life being told I was worth nothing. I'm not doing it anymore. Gideon stared at her, and then slowly he nodded. All right. Then we stand together. Together, Eliza said. That night, they didn't sleep much. Gideon sat by the fire with his rifle across his lap, and Eliza sat across from him, sharpening a blade she'd forged that afternoon. Charlie and Sam took turns keeping watch outside, and Noah slept fitfully in the corner, his small body curled tight under a blanket. As the hours wore on, Gideon finally spoke. I need to tell you something, he said. Eliza looked up. Voss wasn't lying about the law. Out here, it bends whichever way power wants it to, and he's got more power than I do. Then what do we do? Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, We fight smarter, not harder. What does that mean? It means we get ahead of him. We find proof that the auction was illegal. We expose the forgery. We take it to someone who can't be bought. Eliza frowned. Who? The territorial judge. He rides circuit, hears cases in towns that don't have courts. He'll be in Silver Creek in 2 weeks. If we can get to him first, present our case, we might have a chance. And if we can't? Gideon's expression was grim. Then Voss wins, and you and Noah disappear. Eliza's hand stilled on the blade. I won't let that happen. Neither will I. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, and finally Gideon said, You should get some rest. So should you. He smiled faintly. I will. After you. Eliza stood and walked to her room, but before she closed the door, she looked back at him. Thank you, she said. Gideon met her eyes. For what? For not giving up on me. His expression softened. I couldn't if I tried. She closed the door, her heart heavy but steady, and lay down on the bed. Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere in the distance a wolf called out into the night. But inside, the fire burned warm, and Eliza Boone closed her eyes and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could win this fight. The morning came cold and clear. The kind of winter morning where the sky was so blue it hurt to look at, and the air was sharp enough to freeze the breath in your lungs. Eliza woke before dawn, her body still aching from the confrontation with Voss, her mind racing with everything Gideon had said the night before. She dressed quickly and stepped into the main room. Gideon was already awake, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand, staring out at the valley. He didn't turn when she entered, but his shoulders tensed slightly like he'd been waiting for her. Couldn't sleep? She asked. Not much, he admitted. You? Same. He turned to face her, and in the early light, she could see the exhaustion etched into his face. He looked older than he had a month ago, the weight of everything pressing down on him like stones. I've been thinking, he said, about what we need to do. Eliza crossed to the stove and poured herself a cup of coffee. And? We need proof. Real proof. Something that shows the auction was rigged, that Voss's paperwork is a forgery. Without that, it's just our word against his, and out here his word carries more weight. Where do we find proof like that? Gideon rubbed his jaw, his eyes distant. The auctioneer, Kern. He's the one who would have signed those documents. If we can get him to admit the whole thing was staged, or if we can find evidence that he was paid off, we've got a case. You think he'll talk? Not willingly, but if we can pressure him, maybe. Or find someone else who was there, someone who saw what really happened. Eliza thought about that day on the auction block, the faces in the crowd, the men who'd watched her like she was nothing. Most of them wouldn't help. Most of them didn't care. But there had been one man, older, standing near the back, who'd looked uncomfortable the whole time. She didn't know his name, but she remembered his face. There was someone, she said slowly, an older man, gray beard, worn coat. He didn't bid, but he was watching, and he looked like he didn't approve. Gideon's eyes sharpened. You remember anything else about him? Not much, but he stood out because he looked like he didn't want to be there. That's something, Gideon said. If we can find him, he might be willing to testify. And if he's not? Gideon's expression hardened. Then we find another way. Before Eliza could respond, the door to the bunkhouse opened and Charlie stepped out, his breath misting in the cold. He crossed the yard quickly and knocked on the door. Gideon opened it, and Charlie stepped inside, his face grim. We've got a problem, he said. Gideon tensed. What kind of problem? 2 of the cattle are missing, found tracks heading south, toward the ridge. Looks like someone drove them off during the night. Eliza's stomach sank. Voss? That'd be my guess, Charlie said. He's trying to bleed us. Make it harder to keep the ranch running. Gideon's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Eliza thought he might punch the wall. Instead, he took a slow breath and nodded. All right, Sam and I will go after them. You stay here with Eliza and the boy. Keep watch. If anyone comes near this place, you fire a warning shot and then you shoot to kill. Charlie nodded. Understood. Gideon grabbed his coat and his rifle, then turned to Eliza. Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone but me. I can help, she said. I know you can, but I need you here. If Voss is trying to draw me out, I don't want you and Noah left unprotected. Eliza wanted to argue, but she could see the logic in it. She nodded reluctantly. Be careful. Gideon's expression softened just slightly. I will. He left, and Eliza watched through the window as he and Sam saddled their horses and rode out into the cold morning. Charlie stayed behind, positioning himself near the barn with his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the tree line. Noah appeared from the corner where he'd been sleeping, his eyes wide and worried. Eliza knelt down beside him and put her hands on his shoulders. It's going to be okay, she said. Gideon knows what he's doing. Noah looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, his lips moved. No sound came out, but she could read the shape of the word. Safe? Her throat tightened. Yes, she said. We're safe. He nodded, but the fear didn't leave his eyes. The hours crawled by. Eliza tried to keep herself busy, cleaning, organizing, mending clothes, but her mind kept drifting to Gideon and Sam out there in the wilderness, tracking stolen cattle through snow and cold, knowing that Voss's men could be waiting for them. Charlie came inside once to warm up, his face red from the cold. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the fire, his rifle never more than an arm's length away. How long do you think they'll be gone? Eliza asked. Hard to say. Could be a few hours. Could be all day. He took a sip of coffee. Depends on how far the cattle got driven and whether they run into trouble. You think Voss's men are out there? Charlie's expression was unreadable. I think Voss is smart enough to know Gideon would come after those cattle. So yeah, I think there's a good chance he's got men waiting. Eliza's hands curled into fists. Then why did Gideon go? Because if he didn't, Voss would keep taking, 1 cow at a time, 1 piece of the ranch at a time, until there's nothing left. Charlie looked at her. Gideon's not just protecting the cattle. He's protecting this place. And you. The weight of those words settled over her, and she looked down at her hands, roughened from weeks of hard work, scarred from years at the forge. I never asked him to do that, she said quietly. Doesn't matter. He's doing it anyway. Charlie finished his coffee and went back outside, leaving Eliza alone with her thoughts. It was nearly noon when the sound of gunfire echoed across the valley. Eliza's heart stopped. She ran to the window and looked out, but there was nothing to see, just the empty yard, the snow-covered hills, the distant ridge where the shots had come from. Charlie was already on his feet, his rifle raised, his eyes locked on the tree line. He turned toward the house and shouted, "Get inside! Lock the door!" Eliza grabbed Noah and pulled him into her room, her heart hammering. She could hear Charlie moving outside, his boots crunching in the snow, his voice low and urgent as he called out to someone she couldn't see. More gunfire. Closer this time. Noah pressed against her, his small body trembling, and Eliza wrapped her arms around him, her own fear threatening to choke her. And then, suddenly, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. Eliza waited, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, listening for any sound that would tell her what was happening. Footsteps. Heavy. Running. The door burst open, and Eliza's hand went to the knife she'd tucked into her belt. But it was Gideon who stepped through, his face pale, his coat torn, blood staining his sleeve. "Gideon!" Eliza ran to him, Noah close behind. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was tight with pain. "It's just a graze. Sam's outside with the cattle. We got them back." "And Voss's men?" Gideon's expression darkened. "They were waiting for us, 3 of them. We managed to drive them off, but they'll be back. And next time, they'll bring more." Charlie appeared in the doorway, his rifle still in hand. "We need to fortify this place. Board up the windows, set up positions. If they come at us, we need to be ready." Gideon nodded, then winced as the movement pulled at his injured arm. Eliza grabbed his good arm and guided him to a chair. "Sit," she said firmly. "Let me look at that." He didn't argue. She pulled off his coat and rolled up his sleeve, revealing a long, shallow cut across his upper arm. It was bleeding, but not dangerously so. She grabbed a clean cloth and pressed it against the wound. "Hold this," she said. While she went to get water and bandages, Gideon sat there, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the fire. When she returned, she cleaned the wound carefully, her hands steady despite the fear still thrumming through her veins. "You shouldn't have gone alone," she said quietly. "I wasn't alone. I had Sam." "You know what I mean." Gideon looked at her, and for a moment something passed between them, something unspoken but heavy with meaning. "I had to," he said. "If I let Voss take from me without fighting back, he'll never stop. And if you get yourself killed fighting back, then at least I'll have died trying to protect what's mine." Eliza's hands stilled on the bandage. "Is that what this is to you? Property? Something to defend because it's yours?" Gideon's eyes searched hers. "No," he said quietly. "It's not about property. It's about people. You, Noah, this ranch. It's the only thing I have left that means anything, and I'm not letting Voss take it." She finished tying off the bandage, her throat tight. "You can't fight him alone." "I'm not alone." "You don't have enough men, you don't have enough guns, and you don't have enough time before he comes back with everything he's got." Gideon stood, testing his arm. "Then we'll make do with what we have." Over the next 2 days, the ranch transformed into something closer to a fortress. Gideon and Charlie boarded up the windows on the lower floor, leaving only narrow slits to shoot through. They reinforced the doors with extra timber and set up positions around the yard where they could take cover if needed. Sam was put on watch duty, rotating shifts with Charlie so that someone was always scanning the horizon. Eliza worked the forge, creating makeshift weapons, iron spikes, reinforced bars, anything that could be used to defend the ranch if it came to close combat. She also fashioned new tools for the men, sharper blades, stronger hinges, anything that might give them an edge. Noah helped where he could, hauling wood, fetching water, staying close to Eliza like a shadow. He still didn't speak, but his presence was steady, and she drew strength from it. On the 3rd day, the skies opened up and another blizzard roared down from the mountains. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow came down so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The men brought the cattle into the nearest pasture and secured the barn as best they could, but the storm was relentless. By nightfall, the ranch was buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, and the temperature had dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows. Gideon built up the fire until it roared, and they all huddled close to it, wrapped in blankets, their breath misting in the frigid air. "This storm might buy us some time," Charlie said. Voss won't move his men in weather like this. Maybe, Gideon said, but it also means we're trapped. If something goes wrong, there's no way out. Eliza looked at Noah, asleep against her shoulder, his face peaceful for the first time in days. Then we make sure nothing goes wrong. The storm raged for 2 days. 2 days of wind and snow and cold, so brutal it felt like the world itself was trying to kill them. They took turns keeping the fire going, rationing their food, checking on the animals in the barn every few hours. On the second night, as the wind finally began to die down, Gideon sat beside Eliza near the fire. The others were asleep, and the house was quiet, except for the crackle of flames and the occasional groan of timber settling under the weight of snow. "I need to tell you something," Gideon said. Eliza looked at him, her eyes tired but alert. "When this is over," he continued, "when we've dealt with Voss and you're safe, if you want to leave, I'll help you. I'll give you money, horses, whatever you need to start somewhere new, somewhere far from here." Eliza frowned. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I don't want you to feel trapped. I don't want you to stay here out of obligation or fear. You deserve better than that." She studied his face, the lines of exhaustion, the shadows under his eyes, the quiet determination that had kept him going through loss and grief, and now this. "What if I don't want to leave?" she asked. Gideon looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. "You don't owe me anything, Eliza." "I know, but maybe this isn't about owing. Maybe it's about choosing." "Choosing what?" "To stay, to fight, to build something that's worth protecting." She paused. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. You treated me like I mattered, and maybe for the first time in my life, I feel like I do." Gideon's expression softened, and he reached out, his hand covering hers. "You've always mattered. You just needed someone to see it." Her breath caught, and for a moment they just sat there, hands joined, the fire burning between them. Then Noah stirred, and the moment passed. Gideon pulled his hand back, and Eliza tucked the blanket around her brother, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The storm broke on the third day, and the sun emerged, bright and blinding against the snow. The world was transformed, pristine and white and deadly quiet. Gideon and the men spent the morning digging out the barn and checking the herd. Miraculously, they'd only lost one cow, an old animal that had been sick before the storm hit. But as they worked, Charlie spotted something that made everyone stop. Smoke, rising from the direction of the valley. Gideon grabbed his rifle and climbed onto the roof of the barn, shading his eyes against the glare. When he came back down, his face was grim. "It's Voss," he said. "He's camped about 2 miles south. Looks like he waited out the storm, and now he's moving." "How many?" Charlie asked. "Hard to say. At least 10, maybe more." Sam's face went pale. "We can't fight that many." "We don't have a choice," Gideon said. "If we run, they'll hunt us down. If we surrender, Eliza and Noah are as good as dead, so we stand. And we make it count." Eliza stepped forward. "Then let's make sure we're ready." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Gideon positioned the men strategically around the ranch, giving each of them clear lines of sight and fallback positions. He showed Eliza how to load and fire a rifle, and though her hands shook the first time she held it, by the 10th try, she was hitting the target he'd set up. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, Gideon gathered them all in the main room. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady. "What's coming is going to be hard. Voss is going to try to break us, scare us, make us give up. But we're not giving up. We're not backing down. This ranch is ours. Eliza and Noah are ours, and we protect what's ours." Charlie nodded. Sam swallowed hard but nodded too. Eliza looked at Gideon, and he met her eyes. "No matter what happens," he said quietly, "you stay alive. You and Noah. That's the only thing that matters." "You too," she said. He smiled faintly. "I'll do my best." As darkness fell, they took their positions. Gideon and Charlie on the upper floor, Sam in the barn, Eliza in the house with Noah, a rifle across her lap and a knife at her belt. The night stretched out, cold and silent, the stars bright overhead. And then just after midnight, they heard it. Hoofbeats. Lots of them. Eliza's heart began to race. She moved to the window and peered through the narrow gap between the boards. Riders. At least 12 of them, maybe more, moving slowly through the snow, surrounding the ranch. Hadley Voss rode at the front, his face calm, his eyes locked on the house. He stopped about 50 yards out and called, "Gideon Vale, I know you're in there. Send out the woman and the boy, and we'll leave the rest of you alone." Gideon's voice came from the upper floor, loud and clear. "Go to hell, Voss." Voss sighed like he'd expected that answer. "Have it your way." He raised his hand, and the men around him raised their rifles. "Last chance, Vale," Voss shouted. "Give her up, or we burn this place to the ground." Gideon didn't answer. Voss lowered his hand, and the shooting started. The night exploded with gunfire. Bullets slammed into the walls, shattered the few remaining windows, sent splinters flying through the air. Eliza threw herself over Noah, shielding him with her body as the world erupted in chaos. Above her, she could hear Gideon and Charlie returning fire, their rifles cracking in steady rhythm. Outside, Sam was shooting from the barn, his aim wild but determined. The attack lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was deafening. Eliza lifted her head, her ears ringing. Noah was beneath her, wide-eyed but unhurt. She pulled him close and whispered, "Stay down." Voss's voice cut through the night. "That was a warning, Vale. Next time we won't be so gentle."
Gideon shouted back, You come any closer and I'll put a bullet in you myself." Voss laughed, cold and cruel. "You don't have enough bullets for all of us, but we've got plenty for you." He turned his horse and gestured to his men. They retreated into the darkness, their hoofbeats fading into the distance. But Eliza knew they weren't gone. They were just waiting. Gideon came downstairs, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He checked on Eliza and Noah first, his hands gentle as he looked them over for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," Eliza said. "We're okay." He nodded, relief flashing across his face. Then he turned to Charlie and Sam as they came inside. "Everyone all right?" "We're fine," Charlie said, "but we're low on ammunition. Another attack like that, and we'll be shooting rocks." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Then we don't let there be another attack. We end this, now." "How?" Sam asked. Gideon looked at Eliza. "We go to Silver Creek tonight. We find the judge, we present our case, and we get the law on our side before Voss can finish us." "That's a 2-day ride in good weather," Charlie said. "In this snow, with Voss's men out there, we'll never make it. Then we make sure they don't follow us," Gideon said. He turned to Eliza. "Can you ride?" She nodded. "Yes." "Good. You, me, and Noah leave in 1 hour. Charlie and Sam, you stay here and make it look like we're still holed up. Keep the fires burning, keep the rifles ready. If Voss attacks again, you fall back to the barn and hold out as long as you can." Charlie's face was grim, but he nodded. "We'll hold." Gideon grabbed his coat and started loading supplies into saddlebags, food, ammunition, blankets. Eliza did the same, her hands moving quickly, her mind focused. Noah watched them with wide eyes, and when Eliza knelt down beside him, he grabbed her hand. "We're going to be okay," she said, "but I need you to be brave. Can you do that?" He nodded. "Good. Stay close to me. Don't let go." An hour later, they slipped out the back of the house and into the darkness. 3 horses waited, saddled and ready. Gideon lifted Noah onto the smallest one, then helped Eliza mount. He took the lead horse and glanced back at Charlie and Sam, who stood in the doorway, rifles in hand. "Hold the line," Gideon said. "We will," Charlie replied. "You just make sure that judge listens." Gideon nodded once, then turned his horse toward the north trail and kicked it into motion. They rode through the night, the cold biting at their faces, the snow crunching beneath the horses' hooves. Behind them, the ranch disappeared into the darkness, and ahead of them, the mountains rose like silent sentinels against the stars. Eliza held the reins tight, Noah riding just ahead of her, and Gideon leading the way through terrain he knew by heart. She didn't know if they'd make it to Silver Creek. She didn't know if the judge would help. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. They rode hard through the darkness, the horses breathing clouds of vapor into the frozen air, their hooves finding purchase on ground so cold it rang like iron beneath them. Gideon kept them moving at a pace that was just short of reckless, navigating by starlight and instinct through terrain that would have been treacherous even in daylight. Eliza rode behind him,
Noah's small form visible just ahead on the horse Gideon had chosen for its steadiness. Every few minutes she would call out softly to make sure her brother was still holding on, and every time his silence answered her. But he stayed upright, stayed moving, and that was enough. The cold was brutal. It crept through her coat, through her gloves, through every layer of clothing until it felt like her bones themselves were freezing. Her face went numb, her fingers ached, and her legs cramped from gripping the saddle, but she didn't complain, didn't slow down. Because behind them, somewhere in that darkness, Voss and his men were waiting, and the only thing keeping them alive was distance. They rode until the stars began to fade, and the sky turned from black to deep blue, and only then did Gideon slow the horses to a walk. He turned in his saddle and looked back at Eliza. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold. "I'm fine," she said, though her teeth were chattering. "How much farther?" "We've made good time. If we keep this pace, we'll reach the pass by midday. Silver Creek is on the other side. Another 6 hours after that." Eliza did the math in her head. That meant they wouldn't reach the town until well after dark, and that was assuming nothing went wrong. "What if Voss sends men ahead?" she asked. "What if they're waiting for us at the pass?" Gideon's expression was grim. "Then we'll deal with it. But right now, getting to that judge is our only chance. Without him, we've got nothing." They rode on as the sun rose pale and cold over the mountains. The landscape around them was stark and beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. Snow-covered peaks, frozen waterfalls, valleys so deep and quiet they seemed untouched by time. But Eliza barely noticed. Her focus was on staying in the saddle, on keeping Noah in sight, on moving forward. By mid-morning, they stopped to rest the horses and eat. Gideon led them into a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock where the wind couldn't reach them. He helped Noah down first, then Eliza, and she nearly collapsed when her feet hit the ground. Her legs had gone stiff, and pain shot through her knees and hips as she tried to straighten. Gideon caught her by the elbow. "Easy." "I'm fine," she said again, though she wasn't sure she believed it this time. He didn't argue. He just guided her to sit on a flat rock and handed her a piece of dried meat and a canteen of water. Noah sat beside her, his face pale but composed, and she wrapped an arm around him and pulled him close. Gideon checked the horses, making sure they hadn't picked up any stones or injuries during the hard ride. Then he came back and sat across from them, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the trail behind them. "Do you think they're following us?" Eliza asked. "I don't know. If Voss is smart, he'll have men watching the main trails. But this route is rough. Most people avoid it in winter." "And if he's not smart?" Gideon's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Then we'll see them coming." They rested for 20 minutes, no more, and then Gideon stood and began saddling the horses again. Eliza forced herself to her feet, every muscle in her body protesting, and helped Noah back onto his horse. As they prepared to leave, Noah suddenly reached out and grabbed Gideon's sleeve. Gideon looked down at him, surprised, and Noah's lips moved, shaping a word he still couldn't quite say aloud. "Stay." Gideon's expression softened, and he knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "We're in this together. All three of us." Noah nodded, his grip loosening, and Gideon stood and swung into his saddle. They rode on, climbing higher into the mountains. The pass Gideon had mentioned was a narrow cut between two peaks, barely wide enough for the horses to move single file. The walls rose sheer on either side, and the wind funneled through with enough force to nearly knock Eliza from her saddle. As they entered the pass, Gideon raised a hand, signaling them to stop. He dismounted and moved forward on foot, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the path ahead. Eliza waited, her heart pounding, Noah's horse pressed close to hers. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind and the occasional scrape of Gideon's boots on stone. After what felt like an eternity, he returned. "It's clear, but we need to move fast. This is the kind of place where an ambush could pin us down, and we wouldn't stand a chance." They moved through the pass as quickly as the terrain allowed, the horses picking their way over loose rock and ice. Eliza's nerves were stretched thin, every shadow looking like a threat, every sound making her flinch. But they made it through without incident, and as they emerged on the far side, the land opened up again into rolling hills and valleys. Gideon didn't slow down. If anything, he pushed harder, urging the horses into a steady trot that ate up the miles. The sun climbed higher, then began its descent, and still they rode. By the time they saw the lights of Silver Creek in the distance, the sky was dark, and the temperature had dropped to the point where Eliza could no longer feel her hands. The town sat in a valley, maybe 50 buildings in all, with smoke rising from chimneys and lanterns glowing in windows. Gideon led them down the main street, which was quiet at this hour, and stopped in front of a building with a sign that read Silver Creek Inn. He dismounted and helped Eliza and Noah down, his movements stiff and slow. "We'll get a room," he said. "Get warm, then we find the judge first thing in the morning." Eliza nodded, too exhausted to argue. The innkeeper was a heavy-set woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She looked them over, muddy, half-frozen, clearly at the end of their rope, and her expression softened slightly. "2 rooms?" she asked. "1," Gideon said, "and we'll need someone to stable the horses." She quoted a price. Gideon paid without haggling, and she handed him a key. "Upstairs, second door on the left. There's a stove in the room. I'll send up some firewood and hot water." "Thank you," Gideon said. The room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds, a wooden chair, and a cast-iron stove in the corner. Gideon got the fire going while Eliza helped Noah out of his coat and boots. The boy's lips were blue, his hands shaking, and she rubbed them between hers, trying to get the blood flowing again. Within minutes, the room began to warm, and the innkeeper's daughter arrived with an armload of wood and a pitcher of hot water. Gideon tipped her, and she left quickly, closing the door behind her. Eliza poured some of the hot water into a basin and soaked a cloth in it, then gently wiped Noah's face and hands. He didn't protest, just sat there quietly, his eyes half closed with exhaustion. "Get some sleep," she said softly. "We'll be safe here tonight." He crawled into one of the beds and pulled the blanket up to his chin. Within moments, he was asleep. Eliza stood and turned to find Gideon watching her, his expression unreadable. He looked as exhausted as she felt, his face drawn, his shoulders slumped. "You should sleep too," she said. "So should you." "I will. In a minute." They stood there in the firelight, the tension of the past days still humming between them, and finally Gideon spoke. "You did good today," he said. "Keeping up, keeping Noah safe. I know it wasn't easy." "None of this has been easy," Eliza said. "But we're still here." "Yeah, we are." He crossed to the window and looked out at the street below. "Tomorrow we find the judge. If he's in town, we get in front of him and we lay out everything. The auction, the forgery, Voss's threats. All of it. And if he won't help," Gideon's jaw tightened, "then we figure out another way. But we don't give up, not now." Eliza nodded. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the law would side with them, that justice would prevail, that they could actually win this fight. But belief was a fragile thing, and hers had been broken too many times. Still, she didn't say that. She just nodded and sat down on the edge of the second bed. Gideon finally turned from the window. "Get some rest, Eliza. You've earned it." She lay down, still fully dressed, and pulled the blanket over herself. The bed was soft, softer than anything she'd slept on in weeks, and her body sank into it with relief. But sleep didn't come easily. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of Gideon's breathing across the room. And she thought about everything that had brought her here. The auction block, the humiliation, the terror of being sold like livestock, and then Gideon stepping forward, offering her a lifeline she hadn't dared to hope for. He'd saved her, not because he wanted something from her, but because it was the right thing to do. And now she was here, in a strange town, fighting a battle that wasn't hers to begin with, but had become hers all the same. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under. When she woke, pale morning light was filtering through the window, and Gideon was already up, dressed, and sitting in the chair with his rifle across his lap. Noah was still asleep, his breathing soft and even. "What time is it?" Eliza asked, sitting up. "Early. Sun's been up about an hour." Gideon stood and set the rifle aside. "The judge holds court at the town hall. We should get there before the morning session starts." Eliza nodded and moved to wake Noah. He stirred slowly, his eyes opening to slits, and she helped him sit up and get dressed. They ate a quick breakfast of bread and cheese that Gideon had bought from the innkeeper, and then they headed out into the cold morning air. Silver Creek was waking up around them. Shopkeepers were opening their doors, a blacksmith was already at work in his forge, and a few early risers moved along the street with purpose. It was a working town, practical and unpretentious, and Eliza felt a strange sense of comfort in its ordinariness. The town hall was a squat wooden building at the far end of the main street, with a flag hanging limp in the still air. Gideon pushed open the door, and they stepped inside. The interior was simple, rows of wooden benches facing a raised platform where a desk and chair had been set up. A few people were already seated, waiting for the session to begin, and a clerk sat at a smaller desk to one side, shuffling through papers. Gideon approached the clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. "We need to speak with Judge Harlan," Gideon said. The clerk looked up, his expression professionally neutral. "The judge hears cases starting at 9 o'clock. If you have a matter to bring before him, you'll need to file a petition." "This can't wait. It's urgent." The clerk's eyes flicked to Eliza and Noah, then back to Gideon. "Everything's urgent to the people who come here, sir. You'll have to wait your turn like everyone else." Gideon's jaw tightened, but before he could argue, a door at the back of the room opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and lean, with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent traveling rough country. He wore a black coat and carried himself with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. The clerk stood immediately. "Judge Harlan." The judge nodded to the clerk, then his eyes swept the room, taking in the small crowd. When his gaze landed on Gideon, he paused, and something like recognition flickered across his face. "Gideon Vale," the judge said, his voice deep and measured. "It's been a long time." Gideon stepped forward. "Judge, I need to speak with you, privately. It's urgent." Harlan studied him for a moment, then glanced at Eliza and Noah. "These people with you?" "Yes." The judge considered that, then nodded. "All right, come with me." He led them through the back door and into a small office lined with shelves of law books and stacks of documents. He closed the door behind them and gestured for them to sit. Gideon remained standing. "We're here because of an illegal auction in Red Hollow. This woman and her brother were sold to settle a debt, but the whole thing was rigged. The man who's claiming ownership has forged documents, and he's using force to try to take them back." Judge Harlan's eyes sharpened. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" Gideon hesitated, and Eliza saw the frustration flicker across his face. "Not yet, but the auctioneer who ran the sale is a man named Kern. He's corrupt, and he's working with Hadley Voss, the saloon owner in Red Hollow. If you subpoena Kern's records, you'll find the evidence." "And Voss?" "He's got half the town under his thumb, including the sheriff. He's already attacked my ranch once, and he'll do it again if we don't stop him legally." The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "What you're describing sounds like a pattern of corruption and intimidation. But without concrete evidence, my hands are tied. I can't issue a subpoena based on accusations alone." Eliza felt her stomach sink. "So we came all this way for nothing?" Harlan's gaze shifted to her, and his expression softened slightly. "Not nothing, but the law requires proof. If you can bring me something tangible, a witness, a document, anything that contradicts Voss's claim, I can act. Without it, I'm just one man making a judgment call, and that won't hold up if Voss decides to challenge it." Gideon's hands curled into fists. "There was a man at the auction, older, gray-beard. He looked like he didn't approve of what was happening. If we can find him, he might testify." "Do you know his name?" "No." Harlan sighed. "Then you need to find him, and you need to do it quickly. I'm leaving Silver Creek in 3 days. If you can't bring me evidence by then, you'll have to wait until the next circuit, and that's 2 months away." Eliza's heart sank. 2 months. They didn't have 2 months. Voss wouldn't wait that long. Gideon seemed to be thinking the same thing. "We'll find him," he said, his voice hard. "Whatever it takes." Harlan stood and extended his hand. "I hope you do. Because if what you're telling me is true, Voss needs to be stopped. Men like him thrive when good people do nothing." Gideon shook his hand, and they left the office. Outside, the morning was bright and cold, and Eliza felt the weight of the judge's words pressing down on her. They had 3 days. 3 days to find a man whose name they didn't know, in a town they'd left behind, and convince him to testify against one of the most powerful men in the territory. It felt impossible. But as they walked back toward the inn, Gideon turned to her and said, "We're going back to Red Hollow." Eliza stopped. "What?" "We're going back. We find that man, we get his testimony, and we bring it to the judge before the 3 days are up."
"But Gideon, Voss will kill us the moment we set foot in that town." "Maybe. But if we don't try, we lose anyway. At least this way we're fighting." Eliza looked at Noah, who was watching them both with those wide, silent eyes, and she thought about what it would mean to go back, to face Voss again, to risk everything on the slim chance that a stranger would help them. But she also thought about what it would mean to give up, to let Voss win, to go back to being the woman on the auction block, powerless and afraid. And she realized that she couldn't do that, not anymore. "All right," she said. "We go back." Gideon's expression was grim but resolute. "We leave tonight. We ride hard, get there by morning, find the man, and get out before Voss knows we're there. And if he does know, then we make sure we're ready." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Gideon bought more ammunition, fresh supplies, and an extra rifle. Eliza sharpened their knives and checked their gear. Noah stayed close, helping where he could, his presence a quiet reminder of what was at stake. As the sun set and the town began to quiet, they saddled the horses and rode out, heading back the way they'd come. The journey that had taken them a full day and night to complete would have to be done even faster this time, and Eliza felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her before they'd even left the town limits. But she pushed it aside. There was no room for weakness now, no room for doubt. They rode through the night, the cold even more brutal than before, the horses straining under the pace. Gideon pushed them hard, harder than was safe, but he didn't slow down. Not when they passed through the treacherous pass. Not when the trail became almost invisible in the darkness. Not when Eliza's body screamed for rest. By the time dawn broke over the mountains, they were within sight of Red Hollow. Gideon pulled them to a stop on a ridge overlooking the town. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the streets were beginning to stir with early morning activity. It looked peaceful from this distance, ordinary, but Eliza knew better. "We go in quiet," Gideon said. "We find the man, we get him to talk, and we leave. No confrontations, no heroics." Eliza nodded, though she wasn't sure how realistic that plan was. They left the horses tied in a stand of trees outside town and walked in on foot, keeping to the alleys and back streets. Gideon led them to a small boarding house on the edge of town, the kind of place where drifters and seasonal workers stayed when they couldn't afford anything better. "If he's still in town, this is where he'd be," Gideon said. "Men like him don't have permanent homes." They slipped inside, and Gideon approached the woman at the front desk, an older lady with a suspicious expression and a rolling pin within easy reach. "I'm looking for a man," Gideon said. "Older, gray beard, worn coat. He was at the auction a few weeks back." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You the law?" "No." "Then why should I tell you anything?" Gideon set a coin on the desk, then another. "Because I'm asking nicely." She looked at the coins, then at him, then sighed. "Room 4. Upstairs. But if he complains about being bothered, I'm throwing you out." "Understood." They climbed the narrow stairs and stopped in front of a door marked with a crooked number 4. Gideon knocked. For a long moment there was no answer. Then a voice, rough and wary, called out, "Who is it?" "Someone who needs to talk to you about the auction," Gideon said. Another pause. Then the door opened a crack, and a face appeared, lined, weathered, with a gray beard and sharp, intelligent eyes. It was him. "I remember you," the man said, looking at Eliza. "You were the girl on the block." "I was," Eliza said. "And I need your help." The man looked at Gideon, then at Noah, then back at Eliza. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in, but make it quick." They entered the small, sparse room, and the man closed the door behind them. "My name's Thomas Greer," he said. "And before you ask, no, I don't want any trouble." "Neither do we," Gideon said. "But we need you to testify that the auction was rigged, that Voss's claim on Eliza is fraudulent." Greer shook his head immediately. "No, absolutely not. You know what Voss would do to me if I went against him?" "We know what he'll do to her if you don't," Gideon said. Greer looked at Eliza, and for a moment something like guilt flickered across his face. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, I am," but I can't put my neck on the line for a stranger. Eliza stepped forward.
I'm not asking you to be a hero. I'm asking you to tell the truth. That's all. Just tell the judge what you saw. And then what? Voss comes after me? Burns my room? Runs me out of town? Or worse? Then you leave, Gideon said. I'll give you money, a horse, whatever you need to start somewhere else. But we need your testimony. Without it, she goes back to that block. And her brother with her. Greer looked at Noah and his expression softened. He was silent for a long time, and Eliza could see the struggle playing out behind his eyes. Finally, he sighed. All right, I'll do it. But you get me out of this town the moment I'm done talking. You have my word, Gideon said. Greer nodded slowly. Then let's go before I change my mind. They left the boarding house and began making their way back toward the edge of town. But as they turned a corner, Eliza's heart stopped. Standing in the middle of the street, blocking their path, was Hadley Voss. And he wasn't alone. Voss stood in the center of the street with 6 men flanking him, all armed, all watching Gideon's group with the predatory stillness of men who knew they held the advantage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frozen ground, and the few townspeople who'd been moving about quickly disappeared into doorways and alleys, wanting no part of what was about to happen. Eliza's hand instinctively went to Noah, pulling him behind her. Gideon's jaw tightened, and Thomas Greer went pale. I had a feeling you'd come back, Voss said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. Stupid, but predictable. You never did know when to quit, Vale. Gideon's hand moved slowly toward the rifle slung across his back, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. We're just passing through, Voss. No need for trouble. Voss laughed, cold and mirthless. No need for trouble. You ride into my town, steal my property, and now you're trying to turn an honest citizen against me. His eyes shifted to Greer. That's what you're doing, isn't it, Thomas? These people promised you something to lie for them? Greer's voice shook when he spoke. I'm not lying. The auction was fixed, Voss. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows you're a drunk who'd say anything for $1, Voss shot back. He took a step forward. Last chance, Vale. Hand over the woman and the boy, and maybe I let the rest of you walk away. Not happening, Gideon said. Voss sighed like he was dealing with a stubborn child. Then we do this the hard way. His men began to spread out, forming a loose semicircle, cutting off any escape route. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the middle of a street with nowhere to run. But before anyone could make a move, a new voice cut through the tension. That's far enough, Voss. Every head turned. A man stood at the end of the street, tall and imposing in a long coat, a star pinned to his chest that caught the morning light. Judge Harlan. And beside him were 4 men Eliza didn't recognize, all armed with rifles and wearing the grim expressions of men who'd been marshals or lawmen in harder territories. Voss's confident smile faltered. Judge, this is a private matter. Not anymore, Harlan said, walking forward with measured steps. I got word last night that you'd been making threats against witnesses. Decided to ride out early and see for myself. His eyes swept over Voss's men, then settled on Voss himself. Looks like I arrived just in time. Voss's face hardened. These people are trying to steal property that legally belongs to me. I've got documentation. Forged documentation, Harlan interrupted. I had my clerk do some digging after Mr. Vale came to see me. Turns out your auctioneer, Kern, has a history of creative record-keeping. And your so-called legal claim? It doesn't hold up to even basic scrutiny. Voss's hands curled into fists. You can't prove that. I can, and I will, in a court of law, with proper testimony. Harlan gestured to Greer. Mr. Greer, would you be willing to testify about what you witnessed at the auction? Greer swallowed hard, glanced at Voss, then at Eliza. Finally, he nodded. Yes, sir, I will. Good. That's all I need. Harlan turned back to Voss. As of this moment, any claim you had on Eliza Boone and her brother is voided. If you attempt to pursue this matter further, you'll answer to the territorial court, and based on what I'm hearing about your other business dealings, you might want to keep your head down instead. The color drained from Voss's face. For the first time since Eliza had met him, he looked uncertain, looked like a man who'd just realized the ground beneath him was crumbling. This isn't over, Voss said, his voice low and dangerous. Yes, Harlan said quietly. It is. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight, and Eliza half expected Voss to give the order to start shooting anyway, judge or no judge. But then Voss stepped back. His men followed reluctantly, their eyes still locked on Gideon and Eliza with open hostility. You got lucky this time, Vale, Voss said. Don't expect it to last. He turned and walked away, his men trailing behind him like wolves denied their kill. The street remained silent until they disappeared around a corner. Then, all at once, the tension broke. Eliza's knees nearly gave out, and Gideon caught her by the arm, steadying her. Noah pressed against her leg, trembling, and she pulled him close. Harlan approached them, his expression grave but not unkind. You've got some powerful enemies, Miss Boone. I'd suggest you stay far away from Red Hollow from now on. That won't be a problem, Eliza said, her voice shaking with relief. Harlan turned to Gideon. Your ranch is still standing? Last I heard, I left 2 men holding it. Then I'd suggest you get back to it. And Mr. Greer, he looked at the older man. I'll need your formal testimony in Silver Creek by tomorrow. After that, you're free to go wherever you please. Greer nodded, still pale but standing straighter now. Thank you, Judge. Harlan touched the brim of his hat and walked back toward his men, who mounted their horses and prepared to escort him back to Silver Creek. Gideon watched them go, then looked at Eliza. Let's get out of here. They made their way to where they'd left the horses, moving quickly but no longer running. As they rode out of Red Hollow, Eliza turned back once, just once, to look at the town that had tried to break her. And then she turned forward and didn't look back again. The ride back to the ranch took most of the day, and by the time they crested the final ridge and saw the valley spread out below them, the sun was setting in streaks of gold and crimson. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, and in the distance, Eliza could see figures moving near the barn. Charlie and Sam. They'd held the ranch. As they rode into the yard, both men emerged from the house, rifles lowered, their faces breaking into wide grins of relief. You made it, Charlie said, his voice rough. We weren't sure you would. We made it, Gideon confirmed, dismounting and helping Noah down. And it's over. Voss's claim is voided. We're clear. Sam let out a whoop of triumph, and Charlie's grin widened. Well, I'll be damned, you actually pulled it off. Gideon clapped him on the shoulder. Couldn't have done it without you holding this place down. Voss's men came back twice, Charlie said. But we made enough noise that they thought we had a full crew in here. They didn't push it. Good work, Gideon said. He looked at Eliza and Noah. Let's get inside. I think we've all earned some rest. That night, they gathered around the table for the first real meal they'd had in days. Charlie had kept stew going in the pot, and the warmth of it, combined with the warmth of the fire, and the knowledge that they were finally, truly safe, made Eliza feel like she could breathe for the first time in weeks. Noah ate slowly, his eyes moving from face to face around the table, and when Gideon caught his gaze and smiled, the boy smiled back. It was small, tentative, but it was there. After the meal, Charlie and Sam returned to the bunkhouse, leaving Eliza, Gideon, and Noah alone in the main room. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and for a while, nobody spoke. Then Gideon broke the silence. You can stay as long as you want, he said, looking at Eliza. But if you want to leave, go somewhere else. Start fresh. I'll help you do that. I meant what I said before. You don't owe me anything. Eliza looked at him, at the man who'd bought her freedom, who'd fought for her, who'd risked everything to make sure she and Noah were safe. And she realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't making a decision out of fear or obligation or lack of options. She was making it because she wanted to. I want to stay, she said. Gideon's expression shifted, something like hope flickering in his eyes. You're sure? I'm sure. This place. She looked around the room, at the simple furniture and worn floors, at the life Gideon had built and nearly lost. It feels like home, and I haven't had one of those in a long time. Gideon nodded slowly, and the tension in his shoulders eased. Then it's yours, for as long as you want it. Noah, who had been sitting quietly by the fire, suddenly stood and walked over to Gideon. He looked up at him, his small face serious, and then he spoke. One word, clear and deliberate. Home. The sound of his voice, after so many weeks of silence, hit Eliza like a physical blow. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Gideon knelt down, bringing himself eye level with the boy. "That's right," he said softly. "Home." Noah nodded, and then slowly, he reached out and wrapped his arms around Gideon's neck. Gideon held him, his own eyes bright with emotion, and Eliza watched them, her heart so full it ached. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Eliza had ever known. The ranch settled into a rhythm that felt both new and timeless. Work in the mornings, meals shared around the table, evenings spent by the fire. The fear that had haunted her for so long began to fade, replaced by something steadier, something that felt like belonging. Noah's voice returned gradually, a few words here and there at first, then full sentences. He followed Sam around the ranch, learning to care for the horses, and in the evenings, he would sit with Eliza in the forge and watch her work, sometimes handing her tools without being asked, anticipating what she needed. One evening, as she was finishing a new set of hinges for the barn, Noah looked up at her and said, "You're really good at this." Eliza paused, her heart swelling. "Thank you." "Papa said you're the best blacksmith he's ever seen." She blinked. "Papa?" Noah nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Gideon. He said I could call him that if I wanted to." Eliza set down her hammer, her hands trembling slightly. "And you want to." Noah looked at her with those serious, dark eyes. "Don't you?" She thought about that, about what Gideon had become to them. Not a rescuer or an employer, but something deeper, something that felt like family. "Yeah," she said softly, "I do." As winter gave way to early spring, the ranch began to transform. Eliza and Gideon worked side by side, repairing fences, expanding the forge, planning for the future. Charlie and Sam became fixtures, no longer just hired hands, but part of the fabric of the place. And slowly, carefully, Eliza and Gideon's relationship shifted into something neither of them had quite expected. It started with small things. The way Gideon's hand would linger on hers when he passed her a tool. The way Eliza would catch herself watching him work, admiring the strength and patience in everything he did. The way they talked late into the night, long after Noah had fallen asleep, sharing stories and dreams and fears they'd never told anyone else. One evening in early April, as they stood on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, Gideon turned to her and said, "I never thought I'd feel this way again." Eliza looked at him. "Feel what way?" "Like life was worth living. Like there was something worth building." He paused. "You gave me that, you and Noah." Her breath caught. "Gideon, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know. Whatever this is between us, however you want to define it, I'm grateful for it." Eliza stepped closer, her heart pounding. "What if I want it to be more than gratitude?" His eyes searched hers. "Then I'd say I want the same thing." She reached up and touched his face, her hand rough and calloused, but gentle. And when he leaned down and kissed her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. They were married in late spring, in a simple ceremony attended by Charlie, Sam, Thomas Greer, who had stayed in the area and become a regular visitor, and a handful of neighbors who'd come to respect the couple who'd fought so hard for their freedom. Eliza wore a dress she'd sewn herself, simple and practical, and Gideon wore his best shirt and a nervous smile. Noah stood between them during the ceremony, and when the traveling preacher asked who gave Eliza in marriage, Noah said, clear and strong, "She gives herself." The words brought tears to more than a few eyes. Their life together settled into a pattern that was both ordinary and extraordinary. They worked the ranch, raised Noah, and built something that felt permanent and real. Eliza's forge became known throughout the territory for the quality of its work, and people began traveling from neighboring towns to commission pieces from her. Noah grew taller and stronger, his voice losing its hesitancy, his laughter becoming a common sound around the ranch. He called Gideon Papa, without hesitation now, and he called Eliza by her name, but with a tone of affection that made it clear she was as much a mother to him as anyone could be. One afternoon in late summer, as Eliza was working in the forge and Noah was helping Gideon repair a section of fence, a rider appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley. Eliza tensed, old fears rising instinctively, but the rider came closer, and she recognized the badge on his chest. It was one of Judge Harlan's deputies. He rode into the yard and dismounted, nodding respectfully to Gideon. Mr. Vale, Mrs. Vale, I've got a message from Judge Harlan. Gideon set down his tools. What kind of message? The deputy pulled a folded paper from his saddlebag and handed it to Gideon. The judge thought you'd want to know. Hadley Voss was arrested 3 weeks ago. Turns out he'd been running illegal operations all over the territory. Fraud, intimidation, extortion. The whole thing came crashing down once people weren't afraid to testify anymore. Eliza's heart skipped. What happened to him? He's in the territorial prison. Won't be getting out anytime soon. The deputy smiled slightly. Judge Harlan also wanted me to tell you that your testimony, Mrs. Vale, helped bring charges against others who were running similar schemes. Because of you, the law's been changed. Debt auctions like the one you went through, they're illegal now. Can't happen anymore. Eliza felt the words settle over her, heavy and profound. She'd been through hell, had fought tooth and nail just to survive, and now, because of that fight, other people wouldn't have to go through the same thing. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for telling us. The deputy tipped his hat. My pleasure, ma'am. You folks take care now. He rode off, and Eliza stood there in the afternoon sun, Gideon's arm coming around her shoulders. You did that, he said quietly. You changed the law. You made things better. She leaned into him. We did it, all of us. That evening, they gathered around the table for dinner, and for the first time, Eliza felt like she could finally let go of the past. The auction, the humiliation, the fear, all of it was still part of her story, but it didn't define her anymore. She was Eliza Vale now, wife, mother, blacksmith, survivor. And she was home. Noah looked up from his plate and grinned. Can we have pie tonight? Gideon laughed. I think we can manage that. Eliza smiled, her heart full, and reached across the table to take Gideon's hand. Outside, the sun set over the valley in shades of purple and gold, and inside, the fire burned warm and steady. The woman who had once stood on an auction block, worthless in the eyes of the world, now sat at the center of a life she'd built with her own 2 hands. And it was a life worth living. Years later, when travelers passed through the valley and asked about the woman who ran the forge at the Vale Ranch, the stories they heard were always the same. She was strong, they said, fair, honest, the kind of person who'd help a stranger without asking for anything in return. And if you look closely, if you earned her trust, you might hear the story of how she got there, how she'd been sold like property and fought her way back to dignity, how she'd helped change the law so others wouldn't suffer the same fate. But mostly, if you asked Eliza herself, she'd just smile and say she was lucky, lucky to have found a home, lucky to have found love, lucky to have been given a second chance. And then she'd get back to work, because there was always work to be done. And she'd never been one to shy away from it. Noah grew into a young man who was kind and strong and fiercely protective of the people he loved. He worked the ranch alongside Gideon, learning everything there was to know about the land and the animals and the life his parents had built. And when people asked him about his family, he'd tell them, with pride, that his mother was the toughest person he'd ever known, and his father was the best man he'd ever met. Eliza and Gideon grew old together, their hands rough from work, their faces lined with years and laughter, and the kind of love that deepens with time. They never forgot where they'd come from, never took for granted the peace they'd fought so hard to achieve. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the valley was bathed in the soft light of dusk, they'd sit on the porch together, watching the world they'd built, and they'd remember. The auction block, the blizzard, the fight, the fear, and the moment everything changed. Because that's what love does. It takes broken things and makes them whole. It takes lives that seemed worthless and proves they were priceless all along. And in the end, that's all anyone really needs. A place to belong. People who see you for who you truly are. And the courage to keep fighting, even when the world says you're not worth it. Eliza Boone had found all of that, and she'd never let it go. 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 She'd never